And today we are very lucky to have Rob Hoverman, who will be doing the situation of the world economy. And I was thinking about this today, I was like, 25 minutes? Maybe not enough time.
Fair enough.
Encourage him. Maybe we need a whole day, maybe we need like a
Give me an inch.
But we do have Rob Hoverman today to do the situation of the world economy. We'll be talking about, I'll give you 25 minutes to condense it. Might just be a sentence and
I'll be really condensed.
Condensed thought. And then we'll have time for discussion, and then we'll be doing our second half as well. So I will pass over to our lovely Rob.
Right, well, first of all, an apology that it is me. It should have been Liam Winning talking about whether Cuba can survive, but unfortunately he had a family bereavement. So you're unlucky to have me, but there you go. So what's happening in the world economy? Where's it going? I think this kind of all depends on whether on who you are and how much money you've got. If you have £1 million, or £10 million, or £100 million, and you've invested it in the American stock market, then things are going really very well indeed. The stock markets in the United States keep breaking historic records. Higher and higher they're going, and they seem to be dragging up stock markets elsewhere in the world. And in the United States, some 10% of the wealthiest of the population own, by value, 90% of the American stock market. So the richest people are getting much richer by the day. Even if you look beyond that, I mean, it's worth remarking, I think, that the stock market seems to have shrugged off, the stock markets seem to have shrugged off Trump's tariffs, which we thought were going to curb international trade and push up inflation, and they shrugged off the war in Iran, which was supposed to push up oil prices, and again inflation, cut growth and so forth, shrugged all of that off. The United States economy itself is growing by about 2%, 2.5%. China is still growing by 4.5%, at least on the official figures. Europe is a bit more sluggish, but it's still more or less growing. So things don't look too bad, really, from that perspective of the rich. But I want to quickly look at 5 sources of fragility in the world economy, and then draw some conclusions about where we're going with it all. Those five sources of fragility: first of all, global imbalances, then the government budget deficits, and particularly the United States budget deficit, the question of war, and particularly the war in Iran, which hasn't gone away, the climate crisis, which is having growing economic implications, and finally artificial intelligence and whether it's a bubble and all the rest of it. So very quickly, first of all, global imbalances. By global imbalances we mean specifically, or the International Monetary Fund who produced a report on this last week, mean the huge trade deficit in the United States and the huge trade surplus in China. Now, as they point out, countries frequently run surpluses or deficits, particularly depending on particular circumstances. The problems arise when the surplus or the deficit becomes chronic and seems to keep on growing rather than contracting. The United States trade deficit has kind of stabilised, but it's still very, very large indeed. The Chinese trade surplus continues to grow. The change that's occurred, by the way, as a result of tariffs, is that the United States is now importing less Chinese goods, or ostensibly less Chinese goods, probably with a label on them, and importing more from other countries. And China is exporting more to the other countries by cutting prices and dumping their goods on them. Now, all sorts of problems can emerge when these imbalances become chronic. The most important thing is suddenly there's a loss of confidence that that's sustainable for one reason or another, and the money that's coming in to finance the American trade deficit is no longer coming in. So that is a real possibility. More than that, the Chinese trade surplus is clearly stimulating all sorts of protectionist pressures. You've already seen them voluntarily coming from the United States, from Trump, but Europe and the European Union are now looking to impose import controls on China, not least because, for example, Germany, which was the powerhouse of Europe, is seeing its car industry effectively destroyed by cheap Chinese and very good Chinese cars. So that's one source of difficulty, and it's related to the second difficulty or fragility, and that is that the enormous government budget deficits that are worldwide. Japan, for example, has a budget deficit of over 200% of the total value of goods and services produced in Japan, Japanese GDP. The United States, though, is the most significant here. It now has a budget deficit of, depending on how you calculate it, anything from 100% to 120% of the total value of goods produced in a year. This is completely unprecedented outside wartime, or a very serious recession, depression. So, and there isn't a very serious recession or depression. It's completely unprecedented. And the question is, how can they keep financing this? It's costing the American government now $1 trillion a year to finance that budget deficit, which is between $30 and $39 trillion. And that will go up if interest rates go up, it will increase. So, I mean, and $1 trillion, what am I saying here? It's $1 trillion, which is more than they spend on arms in the United States at the moment, although Trump wants to increase that by 50%, so how long that's going to be the case. But it's an enormous amount of money just in servicing costs on that debt. And I want to mention three things which show just how fragile it is. The first is that more and more of that debt is being bought by what they call hedge funds. Hedge funds borrow money in order to buy things where they think there's a marginal difference with something else, and then they can make a huge profit out of that marginal difference by borrowing very, very large sums of money. But if there's a slight change in the relationship between these small margins, they then have to liquidate this. They have to bail out of what they've bought. And so if this happens in relation to bonds, they suddenly have to start selling bonds into the market. If you sell a government bond, which is a debt obligation on behalf of the government, the price of it will go down if you have more than people want to buy. And if the price of them goes down, the interest rates go up because there's an interest paid on these bonds. Price goes down, the real interest rate is effectively higher. So it has profound implications for potential interest rates in the United States, that hedge funds suddenly take fright of buying these bonds and sell them instead. So that's one source of fragility. A second is, and this it encouraged the American government to do something quite extraordinary, really, which was to support the value of the Japanese yen, which they did strangely, not by using euros to buy yen, dollars to buy yens, but by using euros. But never mind getting into that kind of detail. Why did they support the yen? Because the yen has been falling in value, and that is generating more inflation in Japan. More inflation in Japan, which for many years has had deflation, prices dropping rather than rising, means the Japanese central bank has to raise interest rates. If the Japanese central bank raises interest rates, more money will flow into Japanese bonds, because they'll be more valuable now to buy them, and out of US bonds. Moreover, if they want to support the yen by buying yen, they have to sell the US bonds, because Japan is the biggest external holder of United States bonds. So again, a huge source of fragility, and they've intervened to try and stop this happening. And the third thing is that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, thought he'd do a very clever thing. If you issue 30-year bonds to finance your debt, you have to put on them a higher rate of interest, because people are worried about buying them for 30 years because of inflation and all the rest of it. So 30-year bonds at the moment are at the highest rate of interest than they've been for 25 years. So he thought, right, I'm going to do something really clever here. I'm going to finance the budget deficit with 1-year bonds, so that and you get a much lower interest rate there. So we have to pay out much less money on the bonds than if we were doing it on 30-year bonds. Problem is, he has to refinance it in a year, and in a year's time, who knows what interest rates might look like. So it's another source of very severe fragility. And all of that fragility has profound implications for American interest rates, and American interest rates have profound implications for world interest rates because of the way the international financial system works. And the higher the interest rate, the worse it is for the economy, because the more expensive it is to borrow and to invest. Okay, so what about the war in Iran? It hasn't gone away, as we all know. According to the Iranians, not Donald Trump, the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. Now, you might wonder, why didn't the oil price go through the roof? Because a huge amount of oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. And the answer is there's been a whole number of workarounds. 5 million barrels a day were diverted to Yanbu in the Red Sea by the Saudi Arabians and have been flowing out through the Red Sea. The Chinese, very importantly, cut their consumption of oil that they were buying on the international market. And they've been dipping into their reserves, and so has the West. So this has kept the price down. I mean, it's gone up. It was $60 a barrel. It went up to 80, went up to 100. It's come back to 80. So it's higher, but it's not nearly as high as people feared it would go. But the longer the war in Iran goes on, the more problematic it's going to be, because sooner or later they're going to have to start filling up those reserves that they've run down again. Sooner or later China is going to have to get back to, as winter comes and all the rest of it, back to buying. So the longer it goes on, the more dangerous it is that we will see those much higher oil prices. Much higher oil prices mean much higher inflation. They also mean what they like to call demand destruction. That's to say, higher inflation means people can't buy so much, and that means they can't consume so much. So that means a cut in spending, which has a knock-on effect in terms of what happens in the economy, in growth and all the rest of it. Then, of course, there's the growing climate crisis. I just saw something from an organisation called Verdant, which is an economic kind of analysts, who, as you might guess from the name, is associated with kind of green and ecology and the Green Party. And they estimate that the extra heat that we've experienced in Britain this year so far has cost £4.4 billion in lost production because of people not being able to work as efficiently as they were, all sorts of other factors, plus, the burdens of air conditioning and all the rest of it. But more than that, what the climate crisis, the growing climate crisis means, is more extreme weather. That means more droughts in some areas, more flooding in other areas. And in both cases, you're going to have an effect on food production, a really bad effect on food production. And if you add into that, coming back to the Iran war, the fact that fertilizers that are very important, that have come out through the Strait of Hormuz and haven't been coming out through the Strait of Hormuz, they've gone up in price and they've been limited in the amount that's been coming out. So that's also going to push up food prices. So I think there's really inflationary pressure and shortages going to be emerging as a result of the growing climate crisis around all of that. Okay, now that brings me to artificial intelligence. Because if there's one thing that is powering the United States economy, and in effect the world economy, it is the extraordinary AI boom. The massive amounts of investment that are going in to build data centres across the United States. Trillions of dollars. And this is trillions of dollars, not in speculation on the stock market, it's trillions of dollars building things, data centres, massive data centres. And the growth in the United States economy is coming almost solely from that investment coming from going into artificial investment. If you didn't have that, the American economy would be flat or even in recession. That's how important it is in the United States. But it's powering up the world economy in exchange. So what's the problem here? Well, first of all, okay, so let's take it a bit further about why it is that people think, the optimists think this is going to transform the world and make it, so much better for capitalism. The argument is that AI is going to hugely increase the productivity of labour. And if you hugely increase the productivity of labour, you can build a lot more things, create a lot more commodities with a much smaller workforce. In other words, produce them perhaps much more cheaply. And the idea is this is going to generate very high levels of growth, and with that high level of growth, high levels of profits. And of course, profits is what they really like, and it's what then powers the boom in the stock market. So that's the idea. That's the kind of, the optimistic scenario. Much higher productivity, much higher growth, much higher profits. Everything's absolutely hunky-dory. The problem is, the problems are manyfold. The first one is that the vast amounts of investment that are going in without any guarantee that they're going to make the profits that they need to make if they're going to pay off the loans that they're now taking out to invest in those data centres. What's driving the investment is the 4 or 5 big tech bros are saying to themselves, if we don't invest massive amounts, our competitors will, and they'll get an advantage over us. So it's driven by a ruthless competition, pretty much regardless of what the end profit is going to be. And of course, if you have that kind of ruthless competition, you produce, in the first instance, lots of overproduction, more than the market can possibly bear. If you add to that the fact that they're boosting their earnings at the moment by what they call circular financing. This is where they borrow money, or they get money in from selling, issuing shares and so forth. They then lend that money to another company. That company then buys the goods from company one that lent them the money. And that boosts the profits of company one. Marvellous. But it didn't actually find anything outside this circle to sell the goods to make the real profits that they need to make. Now, I mean, who knows whether they're actually going to have these productivity increases? No one actually knows. I mean, there's lots of assumptions being made. But another effect, if they actually get them, of course, is a much smaller workforce. In other words, they're going to throw a lot of people out of work. You throw a lot of people out of work, there are 2 effects. One, you cut their spending because they haven't got wages anymore and they're dependent on benefit. And 2, you increase government budget deficits because they have to pay benefits to the unemployed. So there's a downside, even if it really works, unless you get massive growth, which is extremely unlikely. Okay, so that whole kind of investment splurge is based upon a hope and a prayer rather than any actual analysis that this is going to either produce the productivity increases or produce the profits that they need to pay back on everything. Don't take all that. Yes, okay, keep going. But of course, there's also the spillover effect of all of this into the stock market. Because people go, oh, this AI thing looks fantastic, look at all the investment going in, look at the profits they're going to make. And that's what's been powering the stock market up. And that's been incredibly important in terms of American consumer spending. Because that 10% that owns 90% and which has seen its wealth going up, spends within the American economy 50% of consumption spending. I mean, that's obscene, really. 90% spend 50% and 10% spend 50%. Those are the figures. That's how unequal American society is. And it's the 10% with their ever-increasing wealth who've been increasing their spending, and therefore they're the ones that on the consumer side are powering the American economy along. If the stock market falls, you have a reverse wealth effect. Suddenly, the richest 10% don't feel so wealthy, they don't spend so much. Oops. And that slump in spending, combined with a slump in investment if the profits don't come in, means really bad news. So I think it's very, that 5 sources, I'm sure you can think of more sources, of fragility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, we're not soothsayers, but they're going to be very lucky if they get away with it. That's what I would say. But I think there's something else that we need to say. You see, even if the world economy doesn't plunge into a huge crisis, and I think we have to be careful about saying that's going to happen. We certainly need to be careful about saying we're in a crisis right now. To be honest with you, for the rich and the businesses and so forth, they don't feel like it's in a crisis. They think things are okay. You know, they could be better, but they're okay. But what we've seen over the last 40 years, and under neoliberalism, and there's no reason to suppose it's going to change anytime soon if you look at the way things are moving. Okay, neoliberalism may be partially over because, Trump now believes he needs to use tariffs to protect the American industry and all this kind of nonsense. But nonetheless, the world economy is still very much based upon globalized finance, chasing profits wherever they can get it, and not worrying too much about paying people decent wages. In fact, the whole neoliberalism experience has been about trying to weaken trade union organisation in the working class and pay them less. Actually, up to a point, they've been quite successful on that. Exploitation has undoubtedly increased under neoliberalism. But what that means is, supposing the economy keeps on growing, supposing the stock market maybe has a correction, as they euphemistically call it, but doesn't crash. Okay, But how are people going to be feeling about all of this? Because they're not going to be, the vast majority of people aren't going to be getting better off. What we're experiencing and have experienced for the last 40 years is what you might call joyless economic growth. So that's on the best case scenario when the economy doesn't go fat. So it's not as though the anger that we know is there and the resentment over the austerity, over the fact that, you know, if you've got kids now, it's going to be much more difficult for them ever to own their own house. Kids are having to stay at home. It's going to be much more difficult for them to get a decent job because of what's happening with AI. The health service is on its knees. All those things on which we've depended, which survived, as it were, you know, the growth of social democracy in the 1950s and 60s, they've been eroded and they're making people resentful. Now, what we know, of course, also, is that resentment has been channeled by the right. Now, here I think that big business is being quite clever. They know that people don't like what's going on. But there's been a shift, hasn't there? It's not just the marginal people now who are punting the far-right racist agenda. It's people like that fascist Elon Musk, like Peter Thiel and so forth, using the media to take that anger and resentment that has built up because of what's been happening economically and directed against migrants, directed against Islam and so forth. And this is very sensible for them, because if it's not directed against the people who really aren't responsible for this mess, maybe people will turn around and look at the people who are, i.e. the bosses and the system that they defend. And I mean, just a quick word on Burnham, because obviously, allegedly there's been some kind of Burnham bounce. It looks as though Labour is just ahead of reform now, on the basis, and Burnham says, you know, I'm a new broom, I'm going to do things, and that 40 years of neoliberalism wasn't so good, so I'm going to do something about that. But the fact is that most governments in most economies have relatively little power, unless they do some very radical things to make things better and different. In the United States, Trump has the power because of the size of the American economy and the size of the American state to make some difference. Even he's hedged in, though, as I mentioned, by the fact that he's got a whacking great budget deficit that needs to be financed and so forth. But in a country like Britain, it is the financial markets that dictate to you, and it's you're going to find a way to dictate to the financial markets. And you see this, I think, in Burnham. You know, what's his strategy for dealing with wildfires? Asking retailers not to sell, you know, those home-cooked barbecue things, those DIY barbecues. What's he doing about the cost of living crisis? He's going to make it easier to stop subscriptions that you've taken out by accident and you don't want to pay anymore. I mean, like, pathetic, marginal stuff. So I think the Burnham bounce ain't going to last that long, to be honest with you, because things are looking a bit grisly. Anyway, I need to conclude. What I want to say finally is really this, that the sources of the anger and the resentment that we know is all around us are not going to go away, and if anything, they're going to get worse because of the fragility of the world economy and of the British economy. It makes it an absolute priority for us to do whatever we can to confront the far-right horde, as it were, which is at our door, and the threat of fascism, to stand up to racism, to do everything we can to force back reform and restore. But beyond that, we have to look to the real power to make the real difference to the world, and that is the organised working class. The organised working class has been on the defensive, but I don't think it's going to stay like that forever, and the sources for people to begin to get together and channel their anger against the real enemy, I think, are going to increase, not least through inflation, which is one of those things where it affects everybody, and we'll say, I need better wages. And if they're not going to give me better wages to do something about this, I'm going to go on strike. And from that, everything else follows. Okay.